Sure. So the Equity and Excellence Project is a project that we developed a few years ago, now I think almost 8 years ago, where we thought about the ways our affiliate CEOs could drive questions of fairness, of opportunity, of equity and excellence in their local districts, in their local county, region, and ultimately at the state level. And we got into this work in this particular project because at the time we had Urban League CEOs who were serving on the State Board of Education and on local school boards who were known as being very powerful advocates for students of color, underserved students, girls, but people completely disconnected them from their Urban League role, right? They could only see them as a person on the school board, but their day-to-day work as part of the Urban League, even amongst other board members, was completely forgotten. And we thought that was strange and wanted to really elevate those particular voices, but also prepare our CEOs to be different kinds of partners locally around ed reform and innovation. So that meant putting them forward as critical friends to their local superintendent, state chiefs of education, philanthropic sector, anyone who was invested in the success of children and youth. We thought we needed to bring our CEOs there and have their full weight be brought to bear on education reform. And rather than come up with one or two items that might be the particular interest of a philanthropic partner, a foundation, a corporation, we said instead, let's focus on the things that we know are going to be most at issue in any community. And if you are able to be conversant about these issues, that we will ultimately start a conversation and set of strategies in motion that will lead to greater equity and excellence in that community. So you see here the areas of focus. I won't go into them in particular, but we believe that one of these 7 is at issue in your community. Some takeoff on it, some nuance, but most of what is going to be in driving the education conversation in your community would be found here. So we talked to our CEOs and said, rather than come in believing you need to be conversant in all 7, you need to find the thing in your community that if you don't lead with, no one will take you seriously. No one will believe you're serious about education reform if you're not here to talk about standards, at least to start with. If you're not here to talk about the distribution of teachers, if you're not here to talk about community partners, after school and out of school time learning, we can't get you to anywhere else because you're not serious and knowledgeable about what's happening in this community. So the 5, which now are 7, were our way to organize ourselves, our thinking, the necessary sets of partners, the policy levers that we wanted to pull, and have them be in each of the communities we started with, which originally were 2 states, then became 5 states, now is just over 20 states, and take that feedback from our local affiliate CEOs and begin informing the national strategy and our national partners, right? So we can't float just at the 30,000-foot level. We have to be on the ground, hand in hand, shoulder to shoulder with the communities we serve. But we always want that work to be informed by a national, if not international perspective, and similarly, our national perspective sharpened by local data, circumstance, participation, et cetera. So that was the genesis of the Equity and Excellence Project, and it's the way we think about our work. Accordingly, about a year and a half ago, we began having conversations about ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and put out a number of reports, particularly when it was in the state plan development stage, and said, what kinds of things are going to be necessary for the states to achieve additional equity and excellence? What kinds of things are going to be necessary for us to ensure that there's greater participation than even the law demands? And we thought that having community conversations, standing up local convenings, meetings with state boards of regents, state boards of education, state chiefs, the governors, about the opportunity that ESSA provides. We're very clear ESSA is not a perfect law. There were real issues that we had both in the conversation leading up to the legislation being proposed, and then, of course, as law, it being implemented. But we thought it was important enough to support because it represented a real chance to have a galvanizing conversation. What we saw in the early days of plan submissions were that very few states were taking advantage of that promise. And so we were stuck with how best to get this raised to a national level. Although the plans had been approved by the department, there was still a lot of work to be done. Equity was mentioned in an offhand manner. Many of our friends and partners asked us to be patient because they didn't want to be locked in to language at the plan level that they would have to go back and revise as they began thinking more deeply. So they were intentionally vague and asked us to trust in them, in our relationships, that they would ultimately get to where we'd like to go. Unfortunately, we didn't see much of that, even as plans were refined and then the districts began working on that. So our Washington Bureau, we have the affiliates and then we have our Washington Bureau, began thinking about how they could, how we could make a contribution beyond plan review and talk about what could come out of those plans, a review that was suggestive of what might come next. And so we moved into a review led by Susie Saavedra, Jasmine Owens, Adenike Huggins of our team, and then partnerships that led us to conversations with the Alliance for Excellent Education to think about how else we might do this. And I'm sorry, I can't seem to advance the slides, but we talked about what else might be necessary. And for us, it was, what are the elements of equity that we'd like to see in plans, that we expected to see in plans, hard stop, but more importantly, that we think are actually going to bring about additional equity, opportunity, and excellence. So although the factors, the indicators that we used were not the ones that states were on the hook for, they were not particularly things that have been called out specifically by the law, we said it's immaterial. We don't want them to be bound by the law. We want them to be guided by a focus on equity and excellence. So in the states in which we operate, and you see here a map of those states, again, 36 states plus the District of Columbia, we decided to review those plans. Unfortunately, we did not have the bandwidth to do all the states, but we thought 36 and Washington, D.C. was a representative enough of a group, of a sample size, to say, we have some ideas about what you have put forward thus far and what we think of those, but also where we think you need to go next. And so we spent 6 or 7 months going over each of the plans, using the indicators we ourselves identified coming out of the focus areas for the EEP, but not limited to those, and talked about the ways the states incorporated equity into their plans. And we want to be really, really clear. This is not about the implementation. We did not judge that. We did not intend to judge that. This is literally how people talked about it in their state plans, right? What was in their plans that perhaps tied to a vision of equity that we could stand behind. What things were open questions for us, and what things, either by silence or by stated strategy, were in fact dangerous at best, but likely to undermine equity at worst. So our 12 indicators that you see here are really focused on the kinds of things we think make a difference. There are many other things that we might add to this, and certainly in consultation with our partners, we might come up with a list that is either shorter and sharper on a particular aspect or more expansive. But we're also clear that these are the kinds of things that community members, that young people themselves, that teachers could look at and say, yes, I want that in my state. Right? It was not so esoteric that you could look at this and say, I don't know what these people are after. But you could look at this instead and say, yes, I think all young people, including my child, should have access to high quality teachers, content, principles, standards. That makes sense to me. I think we should all be hopeful that there's a way to tie early childhood, K through 12, higher ed, out of school time, after school together to build an education system that expands beyond a school system. And if we have those kinds of conversations that emerge, we think that the review was worthwhile. For example, here we have stakeholder engagement as a part of what the law required. Some people took that as an authentic challenge to work differently, to talk to people they had not talked to talk to critics who they had typically run away from. And others gathered together, 4 or 5 of their friends, and said, well, yeah, this is a representative subgroup and we're good to go. We talked to all the people we need to talk to. Everyone else can respond to the written document. And we wanted to critique those different approaches, those who stepped out and said, we're not even sure where we're going here, but this is instructive in helping you think through the strategies that we propose. And others kind of continued on with what they've been doing, rightly or wrongly, with little additional explanation, and said, this is everything. And we wanted to take a moment to look at both of those approaches and approaches in between and say, how do we do this well? What kinds of questions should we raise? How do we dig deeper around aspects of equity and excellence to actually improve what happens in this district, in this county, in this state? The more we can get people engaged in a conversation, the more refined, the more thoughtful, the more impactful set of strategies and investments are possible, is our belief. And we thought that the indicator conversation was important enough to talk about where we might go next locally and at the states, but also to set us up for the next reauthorization of ESEA. No, that might not be forthcoming in the next 12, 18, 36 months. But what it is suggestive of is a set of conversations that are happening locally, in districts, in states, and nationally that might help frame what's next. What kinds of things are on the table, are off the table, will you need to address in order for us to think that you're serious about improving equity in education? the more people we can get involved in this, the more people we can become informed about their role and responsibilities in improving equity and educational outcomes for young people, the better off we'll be. And we thought that this report was the best way to do this. In April, we will continue these conversations in each of our affiliates and nationally, and look forward to people who build on this idea as we built on the ideas of others, to again have a genuine conversation about equity and excellence in American education. More holistic than perhaps a simple school-based conversation, important as it is, but a full education system conversation, I think, is what we're hopeful will spring out of this conversation, or a series of dialogues about what's needed, what's going well, what kinds of things and success can we build on, rather than have to throw everything out whole cloth and innovate our way to success. We believe there's enough great examples in current practice that can be built upon and invested in properly to lead us to the outcomes that we seek. We do not need 101 new ideas every year in order to be successful.